All women and men have the same political rights. This is something very obvious to most of us. But in the 18th, 19th, even in the 20th century, that wasn't that obvious at all. It's only in 1920 when American women obtained the same political rights as men, when the 19th Amendment for the American Constitution was passed. This was the end of a very long battle of the suffragists for obtaining the same political rights as men. Rights which were, from the beginning of the foundation of the state, meant to be universal ones. Thanks to a game released by Fourth Circle Games called Votes for Women, we can recreate this epic fight. Hello everyone, this is Michel Sorbet and this is a new episode of Wojennik TV. Today I'm taking you once more to the American continent because I would like to show you a game which will be focused on American history. It will be the review of a very important game released in 2022 by Fourth Circle Games under the name of Votes for Women. Votes for Women is a game released by Fourth Circle Games, which was a game very often mentioned as one of the most interesting war games, political games released during 2022. This is a game created by Tori Brown, an activist, a suffragist, for whom Votes for Women is only her first design. The game is for 1 to 4 players, aged 12 or higher, and the time of play is somewhere around 60 to 75 minutes. The game was successfully funded on Kickstarter. The goal was to gather $15,000. In the end, the campaign closed with nearly $30,000. So, compared to some of the big campaigns on Kickstarter, we can say, well, that was not a great success. But still, we have to underline that more than 500,000 people decided to back this project. The game is focused on the struggle of women for obtaining the same political votes as men, so the possibility to vote. The struggle started only after the foundation of the American state, but it was the most intense in the second part of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, when it became organized, when different structures, when different parties decided to join forces and to fight for their common cause. The struggle lasted for more than 70 years, and it's only in 1920 that the 19th Amendment to the American Constitution was passed. The amendment granting everyone, not depending on their gender, the right to vote. During the game, we can recreate this struggle, both incarnating suffragists fighting for the rights for women to vote, as well as the opposition trying to maintain the status quo and to prohibit women from voting. Today I would like to show you how this game looks, then briefly explain how it works, and in the end I'd like to share with you my final thoughts concerning this title. If you're looking to see how Votes for Women works in the solo mode, because this game also has a solo mode, you can take a look at my extensive after-action report, my playthrough of the game, which I released some time ago. But this playthrough is in Polish, so mind that if you are interested in looking at how the game works in the solo mode. Today I will be focusing mostly on the standard way of playing the game, so the standard 2-player mode, but even though I will also briefly focus on the solo mode and on the cooperative mode, because there is also a cooperative mode in this game. So without further ado, let's now jump right into Votes for Women. Let's take a look at how the game looks and then how it works. Here is a brief look at Votes for Women. Votes for Women is an asymmetrical two-sided game which revolves around the battle to ratify or to reject the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. Two sides will clash. The suffragist side, which will push the Congress to propose the 19th Amendment and then campaign to have 36 states ratify the amendment. The second player will take control of the opposition side, which will try to prevent Congress from proposing the amendment or, failing that, to have 13 states reject the amendment. The game is in its core a two-player game, but it is also possible to play it with 3 players. Then 2 players can take control of suffragist sides. It is also possible to play it solo thanks to a solo mode and to a special dedicated Oppobot deck. But in its core, as I mentioned a few moments ago, this is a 2-player game. The objectives of both sides will be somewhat different because the suffragist side will try first to convince the Congress to present the 19th Amendment, and then, if it succeeds, it will try to secure the support of not less than 36 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. The opposition side tries to block the 19th Amendment even before passing it through the Congress, and if this fails, it will try to stop the ratification process by securing the support of 13 states who will reject the 19th Amendment. Both sides will have their own decks of cards. The decks will be composed of different kinds of cards. Firstly, each side will have a starting card, which will be already on their initial hand at the start of the game, and then both players will be drawing cards from their decks. So, in contrast to many card-driven games, players will not be using the same deck of cards. Each side will have their own deck of cards, and those cards can be cards from the early epoch, then from the middle epoch, or rather from the middle period, and from the late period of the fight for women's rights. So at the start of the game, such a deck should be created in such a way that late cards are underneath the middle cards and underneath early cards. At the start of each turn, both players will be drawing cards from those decks, and using those cards, using a hand of cards, they will be playing those cards in order to execute their actions. Those actions will be related to different kinds of activities. Cards can be played as events, executing the event which is described on the card. They can be used as campaigning actions, which will enable to place additional campaigner cubes onto the playing board in order to secure the support of specific states. They can be used also as organizing actions in order to acquire special buttons, which will be used for rerolls, which will be used to move the campaigners on the board, and also to try to secure strategy cards during the strategy phase. Finally, those cards can be used also as for a lobbying action, which will be focused on the Congress trying to place or to remove from the opposition side special counters from the Congress indicating the current level of support for the 19th Amendment. The playing board represents the United States of the period. It is divided into 6 regions. Each region has 8 states, which are differentiated by their color, also by special boundaries, and in each state players will be placing their cubes. Each side has their own cubes. The opposition only one kind of cubes, those will be the red cubes used by the opposition, whereas the suffragist player will have 2 colors of cubes, yellow ones and purple ones, but from the mechanical perspective, both kinds of cubes of the suffragist player will be working just the same way. The reason why we have 2 different colors is firstly because the author wanted to show the diversity of different organizations, different people who were fighting for women's rights. Secondly, it enables also a 3-player engagement in which 2 suffragist players will be cooperating and trying to overcome the opposition player. So players will be trying to put those cubes in order to obtain 2 things. Firstly, as soon as a player establishes 4 cubes inside a state, such a player can grab a special state card which is associated to this state, because before the game starts, the players will prepare a set of 9 state cards from a set of 12. 3 will be always removed before the game starts. And if a player manages to secure a significant advantage consisting of at least 4 cubes in the state to which such a card is related to, he can grab this card and he can then use it as an additional asset. Secondly, as long as the Congress has already passed the 19th Amendment and it is locked, which means that the Congress is already decided, it presented the 19th Amendment, and voting inside states began. When a player has 4 or more cubes inside a state, he secures that state, which means that this state ratifies the amendment. In case of a suffragist superiority, a special green tick is placed inside the state. If it is the opposition who managed to secure a state, a special red X is placed. Remember, in order to win the game, the opposition has to obtain at least 13 crosses, 13 X's in different states, whereas the suffragist has to secure not less than 36 green ticks in order to obtain the sufficient support for the 19th Amendment. So it is important to have a certain advantage inside the regions, inside the states, and the rules are simple. If a state is empty and if any card or any action enables you to place any cubes, you just place them in the number indicated. If in such a state there are already cubes of your opponent, firstly, you remove those cubes and then you place the ones which are remaining inside the state. So at any given time, only cubes from one player can be in any state, although the suffragist can have cubes of different colors, because those cubes are still counted as suffragist cubes, no matter their color. The game will be played in a series of turns, 6 to be precise. If the game ends at the end of the 6th turn and the amendment was still not passed by the Congress, the opposition player automatically wins. But if the amendment left the Congress and it is being voted inside different states, a final voting is being held, and each player will select one state at a time in order to see if the state finally supports or decides to reject the 19th Amendment. It is resolved using a die roll. To this die roll, we will be adding the number of cubes in the state selected, and the highest result will secure the state, placing the green tick or maybe the red X inside the state. Ties are resolved in favor of the opposition player unless the suffragist player placed and played a special card which enables him to resolve ties on his or her favor. Some cards will be placed into the playing board in the special box, indicating that those cards will be taken into consideration during the final voting phase, whereas some others will be placed onto the board because their effect will be taken into consideration until the current turn, or maybe for the rest of the game. So special boxes are provided. Here we will be placing some major events which were played as events. During each turn, players will be playing through 4 different phases. The first one will be the planning phase, during which players will draw new cards and replenish their hands. Then we will have a strategy phase, during which both players will be bidding a certain number of buttons which they will have in their resources in order to secure strategy cards. This is another kind of cards which is available to the players. Each player can try to obtain a strategy card by bidding more buttons than their opponent. If the opposition manages to bid more buttons, he will be able to select and then to grab one of those cards in order to use them during any of his turns. If the suffragist player manages to bid more than the opposition, it will him or her who will be able to take such a card. In case of a tie, both players spend their buttons and no one can draw a card. Then the most important part of the phase is played. It is the action phase, during which players will be playing cards one at a time and possibly playing also a state or a strategy card additionally, and executing the events on the cards, or sometimes also playing those cards in order to execute actions such as campaigning, which means that players will be able to put additional cubes onto states inside the region where their campaigners are present. Firstly, they roll a die for each campaigner that they have in the game, and then they can place a number of cubes to the states inside the region where such a campaigner is present. So this is the most important way to place new cubes, alongside also events which enable you to place directly some cubes onto different states. Players can also use cards for organizing actions or lobbying actions. Lobbying actions are related to the Congress, whereas organizing actions are actions which enable you to draw additional buttons. Buttons are important not only due to the fact that they are important during strategy phase, or also during campaigning, where you can use a button in order to move a campaigner to another region in order to enable you to place cubes inside this region. They are also used for rerolls. Each time you roll a die, for instance, during the campaigning action, and you are not satisfied with the results, you can spend one button and reroll all the dice. So in contrast to many other games, you do not choose the dice that you reroll all the dice which you rolled. Players will play cards in alternance until the turn ends, at which point players will pass to a very short cleanup phase, and then they restart playing by starting a new turn, always from the suffragist player, and ending by the opposition player. That's pretty it when it comes to the mechanisms and to the basic rules of Votes for Women, but that is not all that I wanted to show you during this part of the video, because a thing which deserves to be underlined and spoken of when talking about this game is also showing you all the additional elements which are part of this game. Because inside the box you will find not only components which will be used to play the game, you will find also a lot of documents, a lot of replicas of some leaflets, of some brochures, even of some newspaper articles, which are here in order to show you how those documents, how those specimens looked in the epoch where this fight took place. This is a very interesting addition to the whole game, which enables you to feel a little bit more the climate, the theme, and to learn more about how the narrative looked when this interesting fight took place. You have even specimen ballots where you can vote for the extension of suffrage to women, or maybe against the extension of suffrage to women, from 1912. So you can see how those documents looked. This is an excellent additional thing which you will find inside the game. Kudos both to Tori Brown as well to Fourth Circle Games for providing those elements. This significantly increases the educational value of the game, as well as the theme, as well as all the narrative which is part of this title. I wanted absolutely to underline this because a lot of elements which in fact will not be used during the game, but which are extremely important elements of the whole design. Having said all that, now I'd like to invite you to the final part of this video, during which I would like to tell you a few words about what I liked in Votes for Women, what I think are its strong, but also what are, in my opinion, the weaker points of this design. So let's jump right into it. Votes for Women is a game which I have been anxiously waiting for, because this is a game which covers an extremely interesting topic. The fight for the rights to vote in America is something which is extremely very important, but at the same time a very delicate topic. So this is something which really interested me, and I was anxious, I was curious to see how this topic will be covered in the game. Additionally, while knowing that the game would be designed and would be then released by Fourth Circle Games and Tori Brown, I was even more curious to see how this tandem would work. And I must say that while playing Votes for Women, I from the beginning had the feeling that the game is extremely thematic. This is something which really stands out. And if I were to say what is the strongest point of this design, I would say that this thematic connection between the mechanics and the theme is something which is extremely interesting and extremely important. Now, we have many wargames, we have many games covering historical events in which mechanics and the flavor, the historical flavor, are two things apart, are not connected very strongly one to another. But Votes for Women is a game in which the mechanics used, the actions which we are taking, the components which we are using are spot on, are really connected to the theme, to the topic of the game. And this is something which is extremely important. Now, the game is obviously a game which has a very strong educational element. It is a game which is supposed to teach us something, to remind us of the very long and finally fruitful fight of women to have the same political rights as men. But this educational aspect is not only translated into the components which we will be using during the game. It is also translated to the components which we will not be using during the game. And this is something quite rare, because in most kind of games which we receive, in most cases, everything that we receive in the box will be used during the game, starting from cards, through maps, through rules, through counters, etc. Here, a lot of components, a lot of elements which are inside the box will not be used during the game. And I am talking about all the additional leaflets, about all the additional brochures, all the additional replicas of historical newspapers or other elements which are inside the box, which are part of the story, but will be not components used during the game. And this is something quite rare, but something which is absolutely great. I love the fact that in the game we received not only those elements which are translated into components used during the game, such as cards with pictures, with depictions of people which were part of the story, of events, of places, with flavor text. Not only we received also an interesting commentary from Tori Brown inside the rules, we received also a lot of elements which are building this narrative, which are additionally enhancing the experience of playing Votes for Women. We will not be using those newspapers or those leaflets replicas during the game, but still, while playing all my games, I kept them near me, I kept them in sight in order to remind me of what game I am playing. And adding those elements adds an additional layer of flavor, which in my opinion was an excellent idea. And I suppose that educational games, historical games, which are supposed to teach us something, should be done just this way. Adding additional elements, making us better understand what was the background of the events which are depicted in the game. Thanks to those elements, we can feel it even more than we would if those elements were absent from the box. The components are of a high quality as it applies to most fourth circle games. So we have a high quality map, although it's not beautiful, it's extremely nicely done in the way that you fully understand what is located on the map, where to place the cubes, how to differentiate the different regions. So it is a nice element. The cards are also of a high quality, with the exception of the state and strategy cards, which I will be referring to some time earlier, a little bit later. But all the cards which are in the suffragist deck, in the opposition deck, as well as in the Opobot deck, have their own pictures, so different persons, different events are depicted with an additional flavor text, and those cards are of a high quality with interesting additional elements. You do not absolutely have any doubt how to use them and how to play the game. When speaking of rules, the rule book is a nicely written one. You do not have absolutely any doubt after reading the rules how to play or how to tackle your first game. I read the rules only once, and then while playing my first game, I had almost no questions and no doubts while playing the first game. And then it's the same applies to the solo mode, even though there are some subtle doubts, but here, using common sense, I was able to play the game even without consulting BoardGameGeek or any other forums. So the rules, I'd say, are well written, and kudos to the designer, to the developer, that they didn't complicate the game too much. Because when designing games about historical elements, about history, about historical events, it's always tempting to include a lot of detailed stuff, to focus on very specific events or on people or on events which are important from our point of view and that we absolutely want to include in the game and to add them an additional mechanical touch in order to make them special, to make them rememberable. But here a lot of things were streamlined, and I suppose it was a good idea, because thanks to it the game is excessive, the game is not too complicated. You can easily play a game in 60-75 minutes without 75 minutes without having to look for specific rules or look for exceptions in the rule book. It's not the case. You should be concentrated on the gameplay and not on looking for some difficult or very specific exceptions inside the rulebook. It's not the case. It's not the case. It's not the case. Then what I really liked in the game is the fact that we have a very asymmetrical game. Votes for Women is a game in which both sides will have their strengths but also their weaknesses. The starting position of both sides is very different. The opposition has a lot of cubes on the board. You have a lot of potential with which you can start the game. At the same time, you have to convince only 13 states to reject the 19th Amendment. The suffragists have a very difficult task because they start with 2 campaigneers, yes, that's true, but with a lot of opposition cubes on the board. Additionally, with a difficult task, which is a task composed of 2 subtasks. The first one is to convince the Congress. Secondly, you have to convince more than 30 states to ratify the 19th Amendment. So this is not an easy thing to do. Both sides will have a different potential, but this potential will change during the game. At the beginning, the opposition has the upper hand. You might feel that the opposition will be dominant, that it will not be subdued by the suffragists due to their initial advantage. But then when we play, when we move towards the second and the third part of the game, we see clearly that the potential of the suffragists is only rising, that the number of cubes they are able to place onto the board is sufficiently bigger than the number of cubes that the opposition can place, that the number of campaigneers is significantly bigger, but that the number of buttons that you can use is significantly higher. So you will be taking the upper hand in the second part of the game. The only question is it not too late to take a significant advantage and to secure the 19th Amendment both in the Congress as well as in the sufficient number of states? Now, when speaking of the Congress, I really like the idea, but that firstly you have to convince the Congress, then you have to convince the states. So we will be having 2 kinds of races. The first one inside the Congress, the second one on the map, where we will be trying to secure the specific states to grab the states card, to grab strategy cards at the beginning of the turn, and then to convince the states to accept or to reject the 19th Amendment. So the opposition has multiple ways of winning, has several ways of winning. It can stop the suffragists from passing the amendment through the Congress. That's the easy path. The second one is to obtain, if the amendment was passed successfully through the Congress, 13 states to reject the amendment. This is the more difficult but more common path of obtaining victory. You can also win during final voting, which is the ultimate voting in case of ending the game on the 6th round and still not having the decision through the required number of states. So the opposition's task seems to be easier, and in most cases it will be easier, but I will be returning to this topic in a few moments. Finally, what I really like in this game is the fact that you also have the solo mode and the cooperative mode. Now, the solo mode works in such a way that you are facing an opponent which is the oppobot taking control of the opposition. And an interesting thing, while playing the solo mode, you can play only the suffragists, so you cannot play the opposition, and I understand why such a decision was taken. I remember when GMT Games released Labyrinth: The War on Terror, they also at first wanted to release only a mode in which you could play the Americans, or rather the Western allies, and without the possibility of playing the jihadists, because they imagined that nobody would like to play the jihadists. But still, I believe there are some people who would like to try it, just to see what would be if they took control of this faction. So the same applies to those for women. Maybe some people would like to play the opposition to see if they would be able to stop the suffragists. Not because they believe that they should do it in the real world, because those are the values that they respect or they live through, because they just want to see what would happen if, or they want to have a more competitive way of playing than only playing the suffragists against the oppobot. But still, having a solo mode is already a good thing. Again, this mode works quite well. Secondly, we have the cooperative mode, in which several players can play as suffragists or also as opposition. We have different colors of suffragists, of campaigners, of cubes, which can be attributed to different players. So this game is not only a two-player game such as Twilight Struggle, in which no more than two players will play. Here you can play in a bigger group, which is always a nice thing when you're searching for a possibility of playing a game in not only by two people but by a bigger group. So what are the weaker points of this design, if I were to cite some of them? Because I suppose that this is, even though this is an interesting game, it is not a game without any flaws. The first one will be something from a non-American gamer perspective. As a non-American gamer, as a European, I'm not aware of all the abbreviations of the states, but the game, the designer and the publisher decided that they will not include a player aid on which we will be having the abbreviations of the different states. Now this is an issue because, as I said, as a European, I was not fully aware of all the abbreviations of the states. Now I'm more used to them thanks to Votes for Women, another educational element of this game. But playing the first game, I was quite irritated by the fact that on the cards we have the full name of the state, but on the board only the abbreviation is presented. So I had to search for the abbreviations in the internet. I had to verify if I am placing those cubes correctly, because I wasn't sure. And given the fact that some of the abbreviations can have multiple meanings from a non-American player perspective, this is an issue. And I know that the game was supposed to be released especially on the American market, but even though the designer, or rather the company, should have taken care also of other players which are based otherwise than in the United States. And this is quite sad, because the game is supposed to have an educational aspect, is supposed to be a game which propagates openness. I would like to obtain a game which would also send a message to non-American players saying just, hey, we understand that you cannot, but that maybe you do not understand all the abbreviations, you do not have to know them. Here is a list, you can use it at your convenience and see what states are presented on the board. That would be so much nicer. The second thing related to the quality of the components. I said that I think that the quality of the components that we receive is really high, but some of those cards are a little bit curved. So they aren't 100% flat, which means that the additional protective layer which was put onto the cards was too thick and the cards changed their shape. So this is not a big issue, but even so, while looking at the components of the game, I had the impression that those two types of cards were of a different quality than the others. Then, what I suppose is also a thing which is problematic or could be problematic for some players is the fact that when you look at this game, you see at first glance a big diversity of what you receive. every card is specific in terms of their name, of the pictures of the persons or of the events depicted. But when you look closely at what the cards do, you understand, you come to a conclusion that many cards do absolutely the same as others. Now, in games such as, for instance, Labyrinth or War on Terror or Twilight Struggle, that wasn't the case. Every card was different and they had a different event. Here, many cards will be doing absolutely the same thing, even though you have a different name, you have a different person depicted on the card, you have a different flavor text. Many cards will say, for instance, place one cube inside a state inside each region. And we have several cards which have absolutely the same text, even though at first glance they seem different. So even having this big diversity of cards, at first glance, you have a smaller number of cards in terms of their mechanics or of their impact on gameplay than you might expect at first glance. Finally, the last thing, which will not be a thing which I didn't like in Votes for Women, it will be a question mark, because I have played both a few solo games as well as a few standard games, and in the standard games, each time the opposition won. In my solo games, I lost my first games against the Oppobot, then I quite comfortably won 2 or 3 games. In my standard games, I played 4 games and each of them was won by the opposition. I have also talked to other friends who played Votes for Women, and in their cases, each and every game ended with an opposition win. So here, I am not absolutely certain that the game is broken. I'm not absolutely certain that the game is unbalanced. I am only sharing with you my thoughts after a few plays. I put a small question mark. Is the game really balanced? I have the feeling that it might be easier for the opposition due to the fact that they have to convince a significantly smaller number of states to reject the 19th Amendment, and additionally, they can also win by stopping the 19th Amendment through passing through the Congress. So they have several ways of winning. So I suppose that it is easier to play the opposition, but I have searched for such topics on BoardGameGeek. I haven't found any. So maybe this is only my perspective. This is only my own experience. And maybe the game is really balanced. It was fully tested. I'm fully aware of it. But still, having played a few games, I have some doubts and I have a small question mark. So here, a big disclaimer, this is only my own experience. This is not a verdict. I am just raising a question. If you have your own experiences with Votes for Women, feel free to share them. I will be glad to hear that you managed to secure comfortable wins with the suffragists. Concluding, Votes for Women is, in my opinion, a very interesting game, a game covering an extremely interesting topic with interesting mechanics, with a great link between the theme and the mechanics, with some hard decisions which you will be taking during every game, deciding what cards to use, when to use them, how to use them, and with different dynamics during the different stages of the game. An asymmetrical game, a game at the same time which is quite challenging, but at the same time also quite easy to explain and quite fast to play. If you're into political games or games which are treating about delicate, interesting topics, Votes for Women might be an interesting choice which you might take into consideration. This was the review of Votes for Women, a game released by Fourth Circle Games. Thank you a lot for watching this review. I invite you also to take a look at my other videos. Take also a look at my Facebook and Instagram accounts. Have a great day and see you next time.